How scapegoat survivors can unmute their right to unconditional support. In the world of the scapegoat child, their needs for care and love from a narcissistic parent are a liability. Such parents consciously see themselves as the only ones deserving of love and admiration. So the scapegoat child is expected to supply both to the parent. As the name implies, the scapegoat child is also expected to bear the feelings of worthlessness that the parent cannot stand in themselves. So the parent devalues, deprives, and domineers this child, which I'll refer to as the 3Ds, so that both parties grow to see the child as the worthless one. So there's no safe channel for the scapegoat child to get their need to be loved unconditionally met. However, this doesn't make the need go away. Instead, the scapegoat child must mute it and find ways to get the conditional approval that's all their narcissistic parent can offer them. This isn't something the child would ever choose, of course. It means finding ways to get the parent to think it's in the parent's self-interest to show the child a positive reaction. The most surefire way to do this is for the child to act in ways that lead to the parent feeling more admired. Here's where achievement comes in. Extraordinary achievements might evoke the narcissistic parent's approval when they perceive the outcome to reflect well on them. Instead of evoking envy of the child, the narcissistic parent may see it as an opportunity to feel like a superior parent, or to see the child's accomplishment as a reflection of the inborn gifts that the parent somehow or another bestowed upon the child. Whatever the reason, the scapegoat child learns that they get a needed but very temporary relief from feeling unloved when they achieve something. In today's video, I explain why the scapegoat child and survivor may work for the conditional approval of others through achievement. This requires them to mute their inborn expectation to be loved just for being who they are. Muting themselves in this way offers the scapegoat child hope that they one day won't have to do this. But on the other hand, they are forced to strive for constant accomplishment to keep that hope alive. When the child gets the approval from the parent that they so desperately need, they get a combination of relief from feeling worthless and a supercharged thrill of feeling worthwhile that can even become addictive. This can drive them to get more and more of such conditional approval. I'll explain what life can feel like for scapegoat survivors caught under this spell. And I hope you watch until the end because I'll show you how to structure your life today to safely unmute your need to be unconditionally loved and surrender the addictive pull of conditional love that's won solely through achievement. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a practicing licensed psychotherapist in California and a scapegoat survivor myself. I've worked to understand what helps scapegoat survivors know that they are now safe to unmute. And by unmute, I mean the ability to honestly say what one desires, needs, and truly thinks. And this has led me to what I call the 3 pillars of recovery. Pillar number 1 is to make sense of the narcissistic abuse so that you can know it was not your fault. Pillar number 2 is gaining distance from narcissistic abusers today and closeness to safe people. And pillar number 3 is living in defiance of your narcissistic parents' rules. Taken together, these pillars empower you to know you can now be safe to unmute and live with the volume up on who you really are. And if you'd like a low-cost option to understand and apply the 3 pillars of recovery in your own life, then I suggest checking out my Rise and Reclaim Healing Toolkit for Scapegoat Survivors. In it, you'll receive my book called Growing Up as the Scapegoat Child to Narcissistic Parents, A Guide to Healing. And this book is a comprehensive and in-depth guide to the 3 pillars of recovery. And if you're a scapegoat survivor, I think you'll find a lot of your own experience in these pages. Most important, though, you'll see how to apply the 3 pillars so that you can reclaim the quality of life that you deserve. And in this toolkit, you'll also receive a worksheet that asks you to brainstorm ways to apply the three pillars on a monthly basis. You can find the link to the toolkit in the description box below or in the link above. Why the scapegoat child must mute their need for unconditional love in the first place. Well, we have an inborn expectation to be welcomed and loved by our parents just for showing up in the world. But tragically, this isn't how the child of a narcissistic parent is greeted. Instead, they find that their parent is far more concerned about themselves. So the child's unmet expectation leaves a gaping emotional void in them. They can't mend the wound by asking the parent to show more unconditional care. Such efforts would get met with frustration, rejection, and even humiliation for the child. A narcissistic parent can easily dismiss the child's desire to be seen as special in their eyes. One scapegoat survivor recalled asking his narcissistic mother why parents get holidays celebrating them and kids don't, like Mother's and Father's Day. The subtext was that as a child, this person didn't feel nearly as important as they should have. The survivor's mother quickly said, "Well, every day is a holiday for kids." And this scapegoat survivor felt incredibly frustrated by this. A narcissistic parent may also reject the child for asking for more than the parent offers them. A different scapegoat survivor recalled asking for a toy when he was 5 years old on a shopping trip with his father. This survivor wasn't reacted to as if wanting a toy was a very normal thing for a young child to express. Instead, their father said, "See, you just think the world revolves around you, don't you? I don't know how you got to be so selfish." The scapegoat survivor felt profoundly rejected by this at the time. And a narcissistic parent may humiliate the child for wanting to be listened to. A different scapegoat survivor remembered looking up to his narcissistic father, but this man was preoccupied with his appearance and performance at work. As a child, the scapegoat survivor saw his father as perfect, but that father spoke very little and showed very little emotion towards the kid. The survivor remembered feeling things quite strongly, just temperamentally. At one point, he got excited about figuring out how to shoot a basket on their hoop in the driveway. So he ran over to his father, who was working in their yard, and announced his feat. His father looked at him as if he was an alien, shook his head, and just went back to the yard work. The child at the time felt intense humiliation at this. The scapegoat child's workaround solution: success equals survival. In the absence of available unconditional love, the scapegoat child makes do with a conditional substitute. Sometimes the child finds that their parent offers them attention when they achieve. The parent's attention in these moments spares the child that pain of not being sufficiently loved. However, the relief is fleeting, and the child is always revisited by this pain. This sequence creates a vicious but necessary cycle. First, the child feels unloved by the parent for who they are. They have to languish in this state. Then the child is inspired to do something monumental to win that parent's approval. So they devote themselves to doing something great. If they capture the parent's positive attention, then the child is euphoric. But sooner or later, however, the parent's attention wanes and the child is back to languishing in that unloved state all over again. It's solidified, though. The only way out of the pain is to achieve and get that blissful but elusive approval from the parent. The child no longer thinks they have a right to their parents' approval just for existing. Their hope for that has been muted. Now they only believe they deserve such responses if they impress the parent. All the other times when they're not at the top of some proverbial mountain, they deserve nothing. Let's go to an anonymized case example to illustrate this. As a kid, Barry had a lot of interest. The world seemed like an exciting and really interesting place. He got interested in snakes at one point and would read all he could get his hands on about these creatures. Then his interest shifted to big cats like tigers and lions, and he'd read all the zoo books in his fourth grade classroom. Barry also lived in a world where neither of his parents showed interest in what interested him. He knew that when he followed his own interests, he was essentially all alone. His mother seemed perpetually angry at him. When he'd get home from school, she'd either ignore him or scold him for failing to do one thing or another around the house. His father's main concern seemed to be work and working out. Their conversations wouldn't last long enough for Barry to tell his father about his own interests. But there was one surefire way to get his parents' affirmation. 4 days out of the year, when Barry brought home his report card and showed good grades, he could count on his parents telling him that he'd done a good job. These were the only times he felt like he mattered to his parents. Over time, Barry began to perceive schoolwork as more important than anything else. Whatever interest he might have had to take a back seat to this. He began to see anything that didn't help him achieve more in school as a waste of time. Getting good grades was the only thing that led him to feel good about himself. Indulging his other interests began to feel like something that just got in the way. The functional but hollow life of the scapegoat survivor. In adulthood, the scapegoat survivor's life is both highly functional and inwardly depleted. This isn't because the mode of achievement is inauthentic or based on the false self or anything of the sort, at least in my opinion. Rather, since nobody genuinely noticed and reflected back the child's natural gifts, these gifts didn't get to feel like they were their own. So these gifts had to become a means towards the end of getting a needed response from their parent. Whatever the child managed to do to win a temporary nod of approval from their narcissistic parent felt lucky. The child's achievements didn't seem like proof of their inherent capability as the unique person that they are. These achievements instead seem like strokes of fortune that the child may or may not be able to do again. The idea that what they achieve doesn't reflect who they are is arrived at because of the parent's fickle or unreliable approval. The scapegoat child lives in a world where they're not consistently valued. So when they do manage to evoke this reaction from their parent, it can seem random. What the child can't possibly know is that what they achieve isn't random. Rather, their parents' fickleness makes it seem so. This makes the adult scapegoat survivor never be able to relax and know what they're capable of. They have to be constantly on guard against failing to meet others' expectations. Here's what life can feel like for the scapegoat survivor who's in constant pursuit of achievement to combat the feeling that they don't matter. First, there's an inner frenzy. They don't want to sit still in a psychological sense. Something inside tells them to keep moving, keep thinking, etc., or else. It might be hard to get to sleep and or stay asleep. Attempts at meditation can get overrun with thoughts and tension that can render it very difficult. And sitting in silence with close friends or relationship partners might also feel very dangerous. 2, life is lived in the future. They have to be thinking about what they'll accomplish next. No credit is due to what has already been done. The only time this shuts off is when they are asleep or perhaps under a substance of some sort. Scapegoat survivors become at risk then for substance abuse or other escapist activities. Third, it's hard to trust people who like you as you are. Relationships can become patterned after what it was like with the narcissistic parent, where connection has to be aspirational for it to be worth anything. So the scapegoat survivor may discount the attention and care shown by those who readily offer it. They may unconsciously be drawn to those who withhold it and only occasionally offer it. This sequence keeps the addiction to the temporary approval alive. Well, let's go back to Barry. In high school, he decided that all that mattered was getting into a good college. He stopped playing his favorite sport, basketball, and he put distance between himself and his friends. He pored over the guidebooks that described and ranked colleges. He'd imagined the wondrousness that he'd get to experience if he could just get into the college of his choice. Barry's life became very regimented. After school, he'd put in his 3-hour shift at a local car wash that he'd work at. Then his nights would be spent studying for 4 to 5 hours. Weekends were the same. He'd work a shift at the car wash, then spend the rest of the day and night reviewing his coursework. Barry felt like he had to force himself to do all this. He was too preoccupied about getting A's to notice whether he found any of this interesting. He didn't feel like he was studying for himself. Rather, studying became a means to the end of getting into a good college. And getting into a good college was a means to the end of being allowed to feel good about himself. But these were not his rules. These were the rules he had to internalize from his narcissistic parents. Surrendering the addiction and unmuting your right to unconditional love. In broad strokes, the goal is to stop employing your gifts as a means to the end of winning the conditional approval of a narcissistic other. Then you can seek and find safe other people who offer approval of you on the basis of who you are, not what you can do for them. Against this more secure relational backdrop, you can re-employ your gifts in directions that you want for yourself. And there are 3 steps to unmuting your right to unconditional love and support today, and they correspond to those 3 pillars of recovery. Step number 1 is to unhook from the addiction of conditional love. As you work through pillar number 1 and make sense of how you were narcissistically abused, you'll also get to see how you survived. And I think you get to see how critical it was to protect your hope of eventually being loved by your parent by winning their attention with accomplishments. Simultaneously, you get to free yourself by understanding how they never had it in themselves to offer you this. It wasn't a failure on your part to win what you didn't get. They just didn't have the love in them to begin with. Seeing through the illusion that you can finally win the reaction you so wanted may be sad, yet can also be liberating. There's something to grieve, perhaps, about not having a parent who could offer you the type of love, interest, and support that you needed as a child. But through that grieving process, possibility opens up. You get to surrender the chase for a ghost. Now the table is set to reawaken what you had always wanted in the first place. Step number 2, find safe others who offer unspectacular consistency. Now that you see through the illusion of your narcissistic parents' inconsistent, yet often spectacular displays of approval, you may be less compelled by it. As stated in pillar number 2, you may begin to put distance between yourself and such narcissistically abusive people today, and you now have a criterion for which to evaluate who is safe to get close to. People who offer you consistent, yet perhaps unspectacular love and attention may be getting to seem preferable to you. You don't just see how such narcissistically abusive people get you high on their approval. You now also see the destructive impacts of this allure. And now that gets to matter to you. The benefits of this stage can't be overstated. Approval used to be contingent upon what you can do for your narcissistic parent. In getting close to safe other people today, such approval is readily offered. It's not contingent solely on what you can do for them. This solves the scapegoat survivor's biggest problem, namely how to feel loved by another person. The caveat is that such feelings in the company of safe others are far less dramatic. And that can take some time to get used to for the scapegoat survivor, just as it would for anyone to wean themselves off of a drug. And step number 3, achieve for your own reasons. Now that your biggest problem has been solved by finding safe people to get close to, you get to apply your gifts towards achievements that matter to you. This is another way of defying your narcissistic parent's rule. That is pillar number 3. It's also a subtle yet extremely important point. As I mentioned earlier, scapegoat survivors may mistake what they have achieved in their lives as false, inauthentic, or solely a product of their false self. It can be easy to come to such conclusions given how they've had to achieve as a matter of psychological life and death. I mean, their efforts weren't voluntary. So it's hard to claim ownership over what they have accomplished under such extreme duress. I think of it as trying to notice and appreciate what you've done under psychological and emotional gunpoint. Under such misunderstandings, scapegoat survivors may retreat from their own gifts. They may confuse exercising their gifts with continuing to do their narcissistic parents' bidding, when in fact, the scapegoat survivor needs to reclaim their gifts as their own and apply them in directions that are meaningful to them. Well, let's go back to Barry once more to illustrate this process. Fortunately, he got into therapy in his early 20s. He worked with a therapist who quickly understood that Barry had been deprived of the unconditional support and attention that all kids need. This therapist saw Barry as an intellectually talented and capable young man who'd had to apply his gifts towards the goal of feeling worthy of love. The problem, as his therapist saw it, was that Barry was trying to win this feeling from parents who were incapable of consistently offering it to him. He saw how Barry today felt tyrannized by the inner mandate to always achieve, and he knew that therapy would need to be long-term if it were going to work. So he formulated that Barry's goal for the therapy would be to decouple his intellectual ability and curiosity from feeling deserving of love. And if the therapy is going to work, Barry would have relationships that showed him consistent care and love for who he is. This would solve the problem that Barry had had to use his intelligence to solve earlier. If Barry were to feel more unconditionally loved, he'd be free to employ his intelligence in ways that were meaningful to him. So, at the start of therapy, Barry found the prospect of talking about himself for 45 minutes to be indulgent. He felt anxious, like something really important was being left undone. And yet, Barry was introspective by nature and was able to talk to his therapist about these feelings. Together, they understood how working, in one way or another, always felt safer to Barry than just being. He'd feel worthless and like he was going to be attacked at any moment when he wasn't working. This was exactly the function that working had served growing up for him. His mother would be far less likely to scold him if Barry were studying, and his father was always involved in his own work. So if Barry were doing the same thing, he was afforded a sense that he was doing what he should be doing, as laid out or modeled by his father. Therapy gave Barry an opportunity to talk about the costs of always having to work for the first time in his life. He described how meaningless life could feel when all it was about was the next achievement. How hopeless he would feel when he reflected on the fact that there was never enough he could do to satisfy these inner voices. How much of himself he'd had to push aside to make work and achievement the only things that mattered. And most importantly, how painful the initial problem that all this work was meant to solve was for him. Barry got to explore and feel justified in his feelings of emotional abandonment that had plagued him for as long as he could remember. His therapist helped him to make sense of the situation that he'd faced as a child, a situation that deprived Barry of the unconditional care that he needed. With this new frame of reference in hand, Barry began to evaluate the people he'd kept in his life today. Most of his friends were similarly career obsessed. He didn't feel particularly close to any of them. He couldn't share ways he felt about life in general, and he would often feel judged if he deviated from their one-track conversations. Over time, he chose to distance himself from these people and take an interest in others who seemed to have more well-rounded lives. His colleague, John, for example, would put in a full workday, but clearly loved spending time with his wife and was very passionate about woodworking. Barry worked to establish a friendship with John. He was initially a little worried whether John would find him interesting, given that all Barry had been about was working. But that's not what happened. John liked talking to Barry. He would invite Barry over for dinner with his wife. Barry felt genuinely cared about by the two of them. They'd ask him what brought him purpose and fulfillment in his life outside of work. And they seemed to want him to be happy, not just interested in his achievements. Up until year 5 in his therapy, Barry's mornings had always consisted of waking up at 4 a.m. and getting an extra 3 hours of work in. He'd then get to his office by 8 a.m. and work until 6 p.m. Working any less than 13 hours a day felt horrendous to him. But this began to shift. It occurred to Barry that he might pick up a book he was interested in one early morning instead of getting right to work. And so he tried it. At the start, he had all kinds of thoughts of falling behind or that he was slacking off, but they gradually wore off as he got into the story. And a few hours later, he was well into his novel. This began a massive shift in Barry's life from devoting everything to work and achievement back to what interested him. He now had the right amount of unconditional support in his life via his friendship with John and his work in therapy to be able to do this. And I hope you found this week's video helpful. If the sort of constant or sort of even compulsive quest for achievement feels as though it's sort of driving you more than you are in the driver's seat of that motivational drive. And I again want to thank everyone for your continued support and engagement with this channel and the resources around it, and the continued engagement in the comments section and support offered one another, and stories of folks' own paths that they've traveled uh, through being the scapegoat child and becoming a survivor, and working to reclaim your own life, and again that quality of life that is certainly deserved. And with that, I look forward to posting again next Friday. Take care.